Our message title for today is up at the screen, and it is this: Growing in Emotional Maturity, the Good Samaritan. We're talking about the Good Samaritan today out of Luke 10. And this is like we're at the very end, almost last few weeks of this series that we began this fall in August until now on emotionally healthy spirituality. So, the heart of this series, I hope you understand now, is this: that the only way to be mature spiritually and the only way you can truly have a deep, lasting relationship with God is by also being emotionally mature with God. So, what does it look like to be emotionally mature? That's what this series has been about. So this really famous iceberg picture that I've showed you guys like every single week in case you forget what an iceberg looks like, okay? So the iceberg series, not this one, the actual iceberg. Can I have the one that's like below the surface? I don't know if it's in there. Yes, this one, okay. So like the majority of the iceberg is below the surface. We cannot see it. In that same way, most of who we are is deep under the surface. Like our past and our history and the way our families raised us and our experiences and all of those things shape who we are. If that 90% of the iceberg is gone, what would happen to the tip? It would just tip over, right? It wouldn't like exist. It would just like, bloop. Like that bottom part of the iceberg is what weighs it down to stay where it is at the water level, right? Like when God calls us to discipleship, what he's after is that 90% under the surface. He's like, that's the part I want to change and grow in you. That's what it really means to be a Christian, is for that part of you to change. All the stuff that we want to hide, all the stuff that we're kind of embarrassed about, all the stuff that we forgot about, that's the stuff that God is after. That's the stuff that he wants to change in us. When we give our lives to Jesus, that's your spiritual birthday, like the moment that you're born, okay? But if you're born and then you never grow, that's sad. That's actually like a medical issue. Failure to thrive, that's what it's called, okay? Like if you don't grow as a baby, like the doctors are very concerned. Like you have to eat, sleep, poop, breathe, and pee, right? Like that's all you need. That's all babies need to grow. And as Christians, too, we need to do those things also. Like spiritual breathing is prayer. Spiritual eating is the word of God. Like all of those things, we all need those things. But here's the thing. A lot of people think, like with a baby, if you just feed them, they sleep, eat, poop, whatever, then they're going to grow because that's their body can do that, right? Like that's how God made us. But as Christians, we can do all the right things. We can be at church. We can read the Bible. We can pray. But that doesn't automatically mean that we grow. We can grow to a certain point, but we all kind of hit a wall. And so there's two myths about being a Christian. The first is that once I give my life to Jesus, boom, I'm like instantly transformed. I'm like amazing now, Christian. And that's it. That's all I have to do. That's not true. We have to grow, and growing takes work. And the second thing is that we think, oh, if they're Christian, then they have to be like better than the rest of this world, right? Like I'm Christian, I'm better than everybody else. The truth is, most Christians are just like everybody else in the world. We're still growing, we're still learning how to be more like Jesus. And so being spiritually mature as a Christian means that we love well. Loving well is one of the main ways that we can be truly Christian. Now, loving well is not an automatic thing for us. It's really hard for us to do. So how can we practically love well? Today and next week, it's answering that question. How do we love well? Of spiritual maturity, growing, because you can't be a baby forever, right? Like, how do I know I'm growing as a Christian? The answer is we love well. So how do we actually love well? Jesus tells us in the greatest commandment is this: to love who? God. And the second is to love others. Okay? Love God and love others. That's the greatest commandment. As his disciples, that's what we're supposed to embody: loving God and loving others. But those two things are inseparable. If we love God, we will love others. If we love others, we are loving God. If we don't love others, we don't love God well. Does that make sense? Like, those two things are so inseparable, like, you can't take them apart. So, like, when I say peanut butter and, there you go, jelly. Like, you just automatically think of it together, right? Like, milk, well, it's trickier. Milk and, what do you guys think? Cookies or cereal, okay? But, like, there's a pair, right? Like, who eats just cereal dry? I think you guys are weird, okay? All right. So, or like macaroni and, see? Like, it's automatic. Like, we all, like, macaroni by itself is just weird. Like, it tastes bad, right? Like, it's just like, what do you do with that? I don't know. Like, those two things always go together. In our house, it's ramyun and, no one knows? It's kimchi, okay? In our house, you can't eat cow. Like, those are, like, you just have to have them. Like, it doesn't make sense without each other. In the same way as peanut butter and jelly, macaroni and cheese, like loving God and loving others go that much together. Like, you can't have one without the other. But the reality is, for a lot of people in the church, we have gotten really good at separating those two things as if they're two different things. Oh, me and God, we're really good. We're really good. I love Jesus. It's so great. Like, we're fine. But I hate that person over there, Like, we've gotten really good at separating those things. And we think that that's okay. When in reality, it's like you're missing half of the equation. That's how important they both are together. So being spiritually mature is loving God and loving others. That's what it means to be mature, okay? Like, that loving God and loving others, that's what separates the spiritually mature from the spiritually immature. Now, we can't point fingers and be like, oh, that she's so spiritually immature. Guys, we've all been spiritually immature, and we all have spiritually immature tendencies, all of us. How many of you guys know you can be a grown person and still be immature? Okay, I have my immature moments too. Like they're embarrassing a little bit, Like, all of us can do that. So we can't point fingers. We can't be like, oh, so immature, man. Because we all are, okay? But that is what separates someone who's spiritually mature and spiritually immature, is how well do they do both? How well do they understand that loving God and loving others is the same thing? That's what separates hypocrisy from genuine Christian, is loving God and loving others together. But we all know, in practice, that's really hard to do. It's really, really hard to do. And you know who the hardest people to love are? The ones closest to you, that you have to be around almost every day. Those are the hardest people to love. In Luke 10, I love this passage because, okay, I don't show you these verses, but the verses that come before our passage are the best. So what happens is, Jesus is teaching, okay? And there's this religious expert. He's like, pretend like, like a seminary professor, like super, super smart, knows everything about theology. This guy walks up to Jesus and he's testing Jesus. He's like, okay, so hey, you're so cool, you know everything. Well, let me ask you, what is it, like, how do I have eternal life, And Jesus is like, Jesus very rarely just answers. He always asks a question back. He's the boss. So he's like, well, let me ask you. What does the Bible say? Because you know everything about it. He's like, what does it say? And the guy answers correctly. He's like, well, love God and love others. And then Jesus goes, you're right. Now go and do that. And then we see in verse 29, here we start our passage. In verse 29, it says this. The man wanted to justify his actions. I think he felt a little bit slighted, like, oh, he put me on the spot. So he asked Jesus, okay, well, if you're going to tell me love God and love my neighbor, then who is my neighbor? He's like trying to get like kind of tricky, like, who's my neighbor? Does Jesus ever respond with an answer? No. He does a question or a story. So here we go in verse 30. Verse 30, Jesus replied with a story, a parable. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. Okay, you guys know the sketchy parts of town? Do you guys know where they are? Okay, right. Y'all can picture those streets. I don't really know where they are very much, but apparently they're there, okay? So if you walk through a sketchy part of town, like, chances are it can be scary, okay? So Jerusalem to Jericho is a sketchy part of town. Guaranteed this guy gets beat up, he's mugged, basically, and left for dead, okay? So not just like, boom, 2 punches done. Like, he's like beat up like a pulp to die on the side of the road, okay? So here's this guy in this condition. Now, have you guys ever seen those videos? I think like some big news outlet a few years ago, I saw this like on Facebook or something like that. Like they did this they like tested this out where this guy pretended to be like hurting really bad in the middle of like a really, I think it was like New York or some kind of city, really busy city. And he was like on the floor, like, oh, and like you could, and like it's like hidden cameras, you know? And like you can literally see everyone's just like, and they're just like, oh, okay, like so weird. And the guy's like, oh, and like it's like getting worse, and he's like, ow! And then they're kind of just like all like, giving him like a wider berth. And then finally one person comes. One person's like, are you okay? And then everyone starts flooding. And it's like a commentary on like our society, right? Like how strange we are that like we just don't help people very naturally. Or we only do if somebody else does first, But here's this guy, and he's actually beat up, like, oh, dying on the side of the road. And so here we go, verse 31. 2 people come along. A priest, who's basically a pastor, comes along. But when he made eye contact, okay? He saw the man lying there. And what does he do? He doesn't just pass by, he crosses the road to the other side, okay? And goes on. And then a temple assistant, this is kind of like, I don't know, like another pastor or whatever, like walks over, read this, walks over, looks at him lying there, like, that's so sad. Like, he literally is like, that really sucks, that looks painful. And then he just walks by on the other side. Like, this is their reactions. Like, these people, basically, like, are the ones who are supposed to be the good Christians, the ones who are supposed to love God and love others. They see this guy, and they walk by. Okay, so we can't judge, right? Like, I don't know, maybe they're busy. Maybe, like, they gotta go because they're, like, really busy with their lives. I don't know. We don't know. But here's the truth of it. Those 2 people, their hearts were not moved. They saw with their eyes and they knew with their heads what would happen to this man, but their heart was not moved to compassion. Somehow, they had compartmentalized loving God and loving others as 2 separate, unrelated things. They're probably busy going to church. You know what I mean? Like, that's what they're probably busy doing. And yet, their heart was not moved. In contrast, in verse 33, that's the heart of the parable, is this. Let's look at verse 33. Let's read it all together. 1, 2, 3. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. He felt compassion. The key word here is he felt compassion. His heart was moved. How many of you ever seen or done mission trips, or you've seen like homeless people on the street? Like, that's pretty easy to see here in Denver. Or like any of those kinds of like really sad, hard things. Like when you see that, it's like your heart is moved. And oftentimes, because we see it so much sometimes, we can get really good at like not getting our hearts moved. But like think of something you've seen, or like, those like commercials or like kids starving in like Africa. Like most of us, like initially when we see those things, like we're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's really sad, Like this person, his heart was moved. Here's the shock factor. The shock factor is it was a Samaritan. Okay, now Samaritans in that time and the Jews, they were like enemies. So this is like the Jews view the Samaritans like inferior, second class, like they were totally different, like religiously, politically, like so many things. They were complete opposites. Think of someone, don't say it out loud, but think of someone you hate, okay? Like I'm sure no one has anyone you hate, okay? But think of someone you hate, okay? Now imagine that person is the Samaritan in this story. Like, Jesus makes the worst person the hero. He, like, totally flips the script. He's like, you Jewish people who are like priests and all the good people, you never stopped. Why? Because your heart was not moved. But this stinker person that you all hate, that's the one whose heart was moved. It starts by our hearts being moved. It starts by our hearts being moved. So then what happens? His heart is moved to compassion. That's where it starts. What if he's like, oh my gosh, look at how, like, oh my gosh. Then he's like, I gotta go. And then he just leaves. Like, what would the point of that be? It wouldn't help him, right? But what does he do in verse 34? It says this in verse 34. Going over to him, which one of the others did that too, but going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. That's the equivalent of like their alcohol and like cleaning their wounds, okay? And then he put the man on his own donkey, which means that the Samaritan walked, okay, and took him to an inn where he took care of him. Not only that, we see, like, verse 35. The next day, let's go to verse 35, the next day, the Samaritan handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, so he gave him money and said, hey, take care of this man. If this is not enough money, I'll give you more next time. Okay, he goes above and beyond. He physically, how many of you guys have had like think of your worst accident? Like you scraped your knee, you broke your arm, like what did you guys do? Okay, like think of that. Like when I was little, actually I think we were in Colorado. So my family loved a road trip. And so I think we road tripped to somewhere in Colorado where there are these like concrete slides. Is this in Colorado? Concrete slides where there's like a sled, like you sled on the concrete slide, and like there's like a lever, and like you go down this concrete slide. Anyway, so I think I was like 8 or 9, and I was racing with my mom. So we're both like on 2 different concrete, like these huge slides, and we're going down the mountain, and I'm like competitive, so I'm like gonna go faster. And so I went faster, and I lost control of the sled. And in my, like, you know your gut reaction? My gut reaction was to brake with my elbows. And so, concrete slide going down, I'm braking with my elbows. This is like torn up. Like, I still have scars on my elbows from that. That was one of the most painful things because it's like literally burning on the way down. And so, that was like the worst vacation. But like, when those kind of like wounds are gnarly, like they just look gross. Like, they look so gross. And I mean, some of you guys are nurse people, so like you're fine, but I can't do that kind of stuff. But like this man literally went and like bandaged all of his wounds, like cleaned him up, put him on his donkey, walked himself to the inn, and paid for his care. Like this is above and beyond. Like this man is practically showing his love for his neighbor, who's actually a stranger, who's actually his mortal enemy, who's probably treated him wrong, and yet he cares for him in this way. So we see his heart is first moved, and then he actually does something about it. In verse 36, he ends the story, and Jesus asks the question, okay, so now which of these 3 people would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked? And the man replied in verse 37, he's like, well, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Go and do the same. It starts with a heart of compassion and mercy, and it leads into action, going and doing. Let me ask you a question. When you hear the story of the Good Samaritan, which is very famous, most of us have heard this before, who are you in the story? Like most of us, when we hear a story, stories are good because we can find ourselves in that story, right? Like we have a character we can relate to. When you hear the Good Samaritan story, who are you? Which character are you? Who do you think you are? The hero of the story is the Good Samaritan. So most of us are probably like, oh, I am the Good Samaritan. I would do that in a heartbeat. But here's the thing, like, Are you the one who walks past? Are you the Good Samaritan? Are you the guy beat up on the road? Are you the guy doing the beating up? Like, I don't know, which one are you? The thing is, we have to recognize that at one point in time, all of us are the guy on the side of the road beat up. All of us have been beat up and broken and bruised. And Jesus is the one who comes as the Good Samaritan to heal us, to make us new, to have mercy on us. Because unless you experience mercy, you could never give someone else mercy. Does that make sense? If you haven't been the recipient of compassion and mercy and grace, it's very hard to give that to somebody else. Like last week's message on forgiveness, if you haven't experienced being forgiven, it's very hard to forgive somebody else. We have to first experience what it's like to have his compassion on our lives. So there's two takeaways I want you to take from today, okay? The first is the heart. Okay, the heart is what has to be moved first. And so heart, the question is this. The heart is full of compassion. Can we have it in the back as well? The heart is compassion, and the question is this. I want you to ask yourself, how did you experience compassion growing up? Remember, you can only give what you have received too, right? So like, if you've never experienced compassion or mercy, it's very hard to give someone else. So growing up, how was compassion and mercy modeled for you? Or maybe it wasn't modeled for you. Most of us, we probably experienced both. Another way to think about this is this. Ask yourself, think about a time, think back to your childhood, and think about a time that you were really, really upset about something. Kids get upset about the most random things, but it's very genuine to them, okay? So think about a time when you were bullied or something wasn't fair or you didn't get what you wanted. Think about like when you're crying and so upset, and think about how the adults in that situation reacted to you. What did they do? Were they like, oh my gosh, it's okay, like, I know it's really hard? Or were they like, suck it up, you're fine, like, it's not a big deal? Or maybe they just ignored you? Like, what was the reaction, generally speaking? Now, the goal is not to find fault in our parents. That's not what today's about, okay? But the point is this. Most parents did the best they could, to be honest, truly. But those early experiences in our lives, they really do shape our understanding of the world. So however you experienced compassion and mercy or didn't experience it, we don't really have a grid for it then. Does that make sense? Like those early years leave a really important imprint on your life. Now, most of us would probably experience both. We had moments where our parents were really good to us and like really attentive and really cared for us, and moments where they didn't do a good job and ignored or like minimized or whatever it was they did. Because parents are human and they probably did both. You probably have both experiences. But the point is this. As Christians, we're called to love God and love others. And we all know that in our heads, right? Most of us do. Like all of us in this room, you know that's what you should do, right? But some of us, maybe most of us, we might be walking around with this like invisible wall around us that really prevents us from loving others because our early experiences were not positive, because we didn't learn how to love others. You don't have to teach a child how to say mine. Never. You never teach a child to say mine or no, but you have to teach a child how to share and how to love others. That's our reality. All of us, at some point, you learned, I need to share and love others. Or maybe you didn't really learn that very well. But the beauty of the gospel is there's freedom. We can choose again to live differently because of Jesus. But you have to be aware. You have to know. You can't be like, oh, I love Jesus, everything's great. And everyone's like, dude, you got relationship problems, man, because like, it's just like a disconnect, you know? And you're like, oh, I think I do. Okay, I need God to like help me with this. It starts with awareness, okay? Like we have to know, because that's how you grow. Nobody here is perfect. Everyone here has to grow in this area, okay? And the second important thing that we see in the Good Samaritan, again, the Good Samaritan had the heart of compassion. That's where it starts. But then what did he do? he acted on it. Go and do. He acted on it physically. What does it practically look like to actually grow in maturity? To actually be that, to love God and love others. Now, let me just give you a clue. This is next week's message, okay? So stay tuned. But the point I want to make is this. You can have as much compassion and empathy and all of these fuzzy feelings as you want. But if we don't do anything about it with somebody else, it's not going to help them, right? Like, if you see someone, you're like, oh, man, that looks so cold. Dude, that sucks. Like, hey, have a nice life. That doesn't help them, right? Like, we have to actually help them to not be cold anymore. Like, so the point is, we have to do both. Our hearts are moved, and then we have to act. So how does what we learned today apply to you? Today is just the beginning, okay? I just want to stir that question of, is my heart moved? Like, do I see other people's point of view very well? Do I only see my point of view really well? Like, I want you to think about it. Start asking yourself, like, do I have compassion? Like, I think I do, but I, like, don't act on it. Or whatever it may be. For you to start thinking about that for yourself. Because again, to grow spiritually is to love God and love others and do it together. Like macaroni and cheese. They go together. So, up on the board, our usual questions, which I sent, I think, to all of the young adults. You have it already. But they're just what I asked you today, basically. So what does it mean to you personally when you hear the phrase, love God, love others? What does that mean to you? Okay? And the next two questions are just what I asked you. How did you experience compassion growing up? And third, what do you think it looks like for you practically to love others well? Can I have the praise team come up? So Pastor Peter Scazzaro in his book, he talks about, I love this quote, he says this, or I think it was a sermon. He said, as Christians, we are called to love the world the best because we have been loved the best by Jesus. We've experienced a greater, deeper, richer love than anyone else in this world has because of Jesus. And so therefore, we have a greater well to pull from, a greater understanding to pull from. Can we all stand together? Loving God and loving others. It's heart and action combined, but it starts with our hearts, and that's where I want us to focus on today. I want you to look at your heart. Think about one person in your life that it's very difficult to love that person. Sometimes it's easier to love the stranger on the street than it is to love the person nearby. But think about, maybe it's a coworker that just bothers you, or a parent that you just don't see eye to eye with, or maybe it's a sibling that drives you crazy, or whatever it is. Think about that one person that you're like, man, it's so hard to love that person. But God, you tell me that loving you means that I love others too. And right now, it's very hard for me to love that person. I want you to think about it, and I want you to pray. Maybe we have to repent. Maybe we've been so focused on ourselves, what God can do for me, what others can do for me, that we have a hard time seeing other people's needs. Or whatever it may be, let's spend these next few moments praying and saying, God, I think my heart is really hard. Or maybe it's, God, would you just show me how I can have compassion? Or maybe it's like, dang, I didn't realize that I had no compassion growing up in my life. Nobody had compassion. We are not a family that showed mercy to each other. God, would you heal that in my life? Show me how I can experience that now. Whatever comes to your mind, whatever stood out to you from today about the heart and your heart of compassion, let's pray for that together right now.